Hello there. Welcome to this webinar on 2018 Cloud and DevOps Trends brought to you by Quali. This is really going to be focusing on some of the barriers and breakthroughs that a lot of the customers that we spoke to experience. My name is Shashi, and I am the CMO here at Quali. With me here is Hans Ashlock. Hans is the Director of Technical Marketing, and we will be going through some of the results of a survey that we conducted over the last year. We had about 1,300 responses to the survey, mostly coming in from practitioners. And we will be, during the course of this webinar, sharing the results as also maybe trying to provide our perspective on them. For those of you who are attending, if you have any questions you'd like to ask of us, just click on the space below and submit your question. We'll do our best to answer it live. If not, we can always get back to you after the webinar as well. So before I get into our survey and results, we wanted to use a frame of reference based on a webinar that we did with Forrester. This was Forrester analyst Chris Kondo, who joined us and shared some of these data points, which really serve as a really good baseline for us as we try to dissect the trends on cloud and DevOps adoption. What Forrester also did was survey about 340 North American and European enterprise developers, and they tried to bring about a correlation between what was happening with software development teams and the impact that moving to DevOps and cloud would have as a result on the businesses. And what they found was these developers were increasingly adopting automation and cloud processes. And as a result of it, they were looking to reduce costs. They were looking to better improve the experience of their customers, better improve the products and services, as well as to grow the top line revenue. And you'll see on the right side that almost 30% or 20%, as the case may be, felt this direct correlation between their efforts as well as the impact on revenue. And I wanted to use this as a baseline as we go forward in dissecting the results from our own survey, and also to compare with what we had from last year. This is Quali's third annual survey on the cloud and DevOps adoption trends. And what we did last year was also try and encapsulate the results that we got from that survey in terms of some of the top 10 barriers to move to DevOps adoption. And what you see here on the screen, for example, are the top 10 barriers listed in the order of the complexity of the barrier that we received from the responses, with culture being number one, test automation in conjunction with DevOps being number two, integration of legacy infrastructure and processes being number three. And then you go further down the list with application complexity, lack of planning, the ability or inability to manage environments, lack of training and skill set, budget allocation, tool fragmentation in the sense there were a number of tools, disparate tools in the process chain, as well as in many cases the lack of executive support or buy-in. So these were the top 10 barriers at the end of 2016, and again we wanted to share this with you as a frame of reference as we now look at the results of the survey from 2017. This shows the number of responses that we received as well as the titles that responded to us. A majority of them were practitioners in the cloud and DevOps space. The demographic we used was primarily North America and Europe. In a way, it was somewhat similar to the demographic of the Forrester survey, except we had almost 5 times as many responses. And when we move forward, we will dissect the percentage responses that we received for some of the questions that we had asked during the course of the survey as well. So the first one was in regards to automation. So we wanted to get a sense of how many R&D teams are already using automation in their processes? How mature are these in terms of their ability to be coupled with self-service mechanisms? And what we saw was somewhat of an equal distribution between those enterprises that were using automation and had embraced self-service mechanisms. And there were those that had automation but were yet to bring on self-service and cloud-like capabilities. And then there was a third of them that didn't really have a mature enough automation process that was prevalent in their organization. And so this was an interesting trend in the sense that almost 66% had embraced automation in some way, shape, or form, but they were maybe looking to increase the productivity of their teams with self-service capabilities. And if you compare that with the trend from 2016, we saw that number of people that had access to self-service environments had actually grown in 2017. So this to us really represents the intertwining of the boundaries between DevOps and cloud-like processes, and it also shows the maturity of an organization's evolution as they progress along the automation journey. The next question really had to do with understanding the cloud strategy of an enterprise. First of all, we're trying to get a better sense of, are they down the path of embracing cloud technologies? And if so, what type and what flavor of cloud deployment are they more keen to pursue? So in that context, we saw a somewhat predictable distribution towards public cloud only deployments, which was really a third of the surveyed responses. We had about 26% that were only on private cloud, which, as you can imagine, was some of the larger enterprises. And a fraction of them, about 15%, had currently no cloud deployment plans. And what was also somewhat unsurprising was the hybrid cloud adoption, or the number of people that said they want to go or have already gone down the path of hybrid cloud. And this was almost 40%. So this trend is something that we have been monitoring very closely, because it does provide a lot of flexibility for enterprises that have a private cloud or an on-premise data center, and they want to bring certain workloads into the public cloud. And during this process, it makes sense for them to really establish a sense of consistency of processes, and it's also a bit of a complex barrier to overcome when you want to reconcile the private and public cloud operational models as well. So in that sense, we saw an uptick in number of responses saying they were adopting or were in the process of adopting hybrid clouds go up from 23% in 2016 to 39% in 2017. And frankly, we expect this trend to grow a little bit as hybrid cloud tools, processes, platforms, and operational models become a lot more mature. And at the same time, we do expect it to plateau in the sense that we don't expect the workloads to become entirely public cloud based or entirely private cloud based. There are advantages to both. We also wanted to get a better sense of what were some of the barriers for them to move to a cloud-based model. And in this instance, we weren't restricting it to public cloud only. We made the question somewhat generic in terms of cloud rollout. So we found a lot of responses coming back with the thinking that this is a public cloud question. And so you will see things like compliance, you'll see things like risk and security. So these were kind of intertwined. As also complexity, which had the lion's share of responses in terms of it being a barrier to cloud-based models, and cost. So while we didn't actually specify public cloud, what we found out based on our own analysis is the audience interpreted this question to be along the lines of public cloud, and the answers were also along those same lines. And it's interesting to see, complexity being such a big chunk. And this is something we can discuss a bit further in terms of what is it that it is making it so complex for somebody to go adopt something that's supposedly so easy. And this is a good topic for us to tackle. Shifting to DevOps, we also started to measure some of these barriers for DevOps and try to align them with what we had seen in the previous years. If you look at some of the external analysts, whether it be Gartner or Forrester, they've been all calling out 2017-18 as the year where DevOps has gone mainstream. And we've actually been having a lot of conversations with customers, prospects, both in North America as well as in Europe and some in Asia Pacific region. And we see that it's certainly taking off, particularly in mid to large enterprises. And they've been embracing pilot projects with certain teams to go down the DevOps route, and then as these projects become more mature, they proliferate through the rest of the organization. And in that context, we were trying to see what it would entail for them to grease the skids and make DevOps a lot more mainstream across the entire organization, and what were the impeding factors. So in that context, again, it was somewhat interesting. We saw that there was more adoption for DevOps, but at the same time, we saw some of the impediments that were flagged earlier in 2016. For example, culture was the #1 barrier, with 14% of responses saying, hey, that's a big impediment for us in 2016. And we actually saw that go up in 2017, which was a bit surprising because we have tools that are a lot more mature. We have a lot more executive buy-in, and you would imagine that culture would also be a lot more easier to navigate. But we had almost 22% of responses come back and say, that's still the #1 barrier. And then following very closely behind were legacy, and in this context, it's both legacy applications as well as legacy environments. Just being able to onboard that legacy, which you don't want to obviously discard, you want to preserve it, especially if it's working, and to integrate with DevOps processes. That was a very close #2 behind culture, and I would say they're kind of on equal legs there. The third was complexity. So this thing is rearing its ugly head in almost every response that we solicit, and complexity in some way, shape, or form is a huge impediment. And the more that organizations can do to simplify and attack this barrier up front, it actually impacts the other things too, including culture. Testing or continuous testing was another issue that came up in terms of their ability to dish up test environments and integrate it as a part of the CICD cycle. Likewise, as environments become a lot more distributed and complex, the ability to manage these, the ability to spin it up or spin it down and make it available in an automated fashion for the CI/CD processes was also something that came up very strongly. And the last one was around budget, and we saw that the lack of management buy-in had almost gone down, lack of fragmented tools had gone down, or maybe it was under complexity. But what was refreshing there seems to be a recognition of the fact that embracing DevOps is a means to organizational efficiency as well as productivity, and so budget is being allocated against it, and it's not a top order barrier. So this is a very interesting set of findings for us. Next, we tackle the question on some of the infrastructure dependency for DevOps. A lot of people like to think that it's all application based and there isn't necessarily any infrastructure relevancy or dependency, but time and again we have actually found that to be false. There is a significant dependency on how infrastructure gets stood up, whether it be in the context of on-premise release management cycle or if it's in the PaaS environment. And there is also the aspect of the processes involved with it. Because one of the reasons why we had the self-service question was, does somebody else need to be in the way to grant access to infrastructure for the DevOps professional or for the application developer to be a lot more productive? And in most cases, the answer was yes. And in most cases, the organization that was responsible for delivering infrastructure was a different organization, usually the IT organization. And what we also found was that it takes time for somebody requesting access to a certain infrastructure or environment for their DevOps cycle to be effective. It had to be routed through a ticket-based mechanism, and sometimes these tickets were resolved fairly quickly, and sometimes they took a few weeks or in certain cases over a month. And so that's the interesting breakdown that you see there when we asked how long it takes for somebody to deliver infrastructure for their DevOps and DevTest teams. We had almost a little over a quarter responses come back and say we get access to this within a day. And another quarter said it takes us over a month, and everybody else was in between. And if we compare this with what transpired in the 2016 survey, we had almost 26% say it takes them over a month to get access to that infrastructure. So really this is within the margin of error, survey error, and we see that complexity and dependency hasn't necessarily gone away. Next, we try to sort of get a better understanding of some of the automation tools. And in this case, again, we try to bring these two elements of cloud automation and DevOps automation tools together. And we got some mixed responses there. What we saw was, Jenkins popped up big time. It's mostly used in the context of release automation and DevOps. But we, because of the way the questions were asked and how people were answering, we saw Jenkins pop up big time. And contrasting this with what we saw in 2016, there also Jenkins was number one in terms of 21% versus 34% this year. And this is the open source version of Jenkins, not a productized packaged version. So there is definitely a fair degree of adoption of the open source Jenkins toolset. And then we saw Puppet and Chef, not surprisingly, again, open source version and maybe some packaged versions come in as number two, number three and number four. Ansible was number two, so this was in the context of DevOps again. And then we had, VMware's toolchain, IBM's Urban Code, and CloudFormation. So these are all available in different slices, if you will. And we expect, continued adoption of Jenkins, especially in the DevOps construct. And as we go towards cloud management tool sets, we do see a lot more packaged offerings there with vendors that are in a position to manage and orchestrate their cloud platforms. Then we try to get a breakdown in terms of the maturity of the DevOps processes, looking at it has three distinct subsegments, if you will. We tried to see who were down the path of continuous integration in their processes, who was looking at continuous deployment, and then where did continuous testing fit in. So here, a lot of them had embarked upon the continuous integration, so that meant that in the developer side of the house, there was a lot more adoption and the evolution of the agile methodologies. And then we saw continuous deployment also start to happen with a lot of real-time, just-in-time deployment approaches that were being adopted in certain organizations. And then what we had pointed out between last year and this year was really calling out continuous testing almost as a standalone in this CICD life cycle. And we did see a little over a quarter of the responses come back and say they were embracing continuous testing or were down the path of doing so. And that was an encouraging sign, because that's really what allows most organizations to shift left in a much more efficient manner, where they can bring quality left. And obviously when you bring quality early on in the life cycle, it also helps cut down the cost of the release and the need for reworking. And a little under 10% had no adoption of CICDs in a mature enough way that they could comment on it. We also wanted to get a better understanding of what organizations were doing to enable cloud and DevOps adoption. And clearly, organizations that were mature enough and were building these processes to scale were also investing in some sort of a competency center or a center of excellence within their organization that would focus on cloud and DevOps processes, tools, platforms, and would really serve as a poster child for the rest of the organization. And it was this investment in this competency center where they would actually evaluate different tools and platforms, formulate the templates and best practices, and try out different methodologies, and really help build a template for the rest of the organization. It usually had an executive sponsor, and over time it was also externally facing, in the sense if this organization had customers, then they could look at what this competency center had accomplished and learn from that. So in a way it was a learning bed as well, in the way that different organizations had built it up. And what was encouraging for us was that almost 2/3 of the survey responses said they're actually investing in such centers or were in the process of planning to do so. And this is something that we view as a catalyst, particularly for somebody who wants to standardize on cloud and DevOps practices across their organization, make things a lot more consistent, which in turn would allow them to scale much more rapidly and in a much more predictable manner. So those were some of the high-level results of the survey. And what we did was we encapsulated these results in a few infographics. One was really capturing what the barriers to cloud were, and we had 5 of the top barriers that were captured. That's available now as an infographic. And we also tried to take our stab in terms of the solutions that we've been providing in terms of how environment setup, managing environment complexity, self-service mechanisms, automation, all in the construct of cloud and DevOps with sandbox-like processes can help break those barriers down. And so that's a second infographic that you would see. Both are available for download on the link that you see at the bottom of the screen. We also did something very similar for DevOps as well, where we looked at the top 7 barriers here, and each of these had a significant enough percentage for us to recognize that barrier in a distinct manner. And we did something very similar where we said, how do we overcome these barriers with the ability to break them down, dissolve them with environments as a service associated with each of those different stages. So again, these infographics are also available for download on the link that you see at the bottom of the screen. So with that, we want to summarize here and maybe have a discussion quickly on the top insights that we gleaned from this survey, and where we saw the needle getting moved a bit, and where also we saw sometimes in the positive direction and sometimes in the negative direction. But it was good to distill it and look at it through the lens of these 5 insights. And I want Hans to really join in with the experience that he's had, especially with the number of prospects and customers and partners that we've talked to maybe go and look at these insights, and we could give our perspective and see how well it resonates with you all. The first one was really that it's seemed to be a no-brainer to go and embrace automation and self-service mechanisms. Certainly, automation seemed to be something that almost every CIO has given their buy-in to, and it's not whether they need to do it. It's really the best possible automation strategy that a organization needs to embrace, because it might be unique for each organization.
Yeah, and if you look at the CICD numbers, those are huge. They're very positive, right? I mean, was it 91% have some sort of CICD process in place, which is built on automation. I think those numbers are a little aspirational. So I think the fact that budgets are being spent, I think everyone wants to be doing it, and they're doing it somewhere. That coupled with some of the other numbers, the challenges around complexity, you scratch at the surface, and I think there's definitely automation happening in pockets. How successful organizations are at bringing that automation at an organizational level, I think, is another question. But one of the positive things I think that we see there is that we're seeing organizations across industries adopt these practices. So it's not just the software, the businesses that are focusing on software as their expertise, but traditional enterprises, service providers across the board are adopting the automation and self-service CI/CD practices.
That's true, because every organization is today evolved into a software organization, and so in some ways you can abstract and say a lot of the patterns that we're seeing are somewhat similar, regardless of the vertical or industry that they belong to. And what I found also surprising was the intertwining between cloud and DevOps automation. It almost seems as if one is a trigger for the other. They go down the path of DevOps and they realize the efficacy of cloud-based models, or if they want to move to the cloud, again, DevOps practices helps them to do it in a much more graceful and efficient manner. So we're seeing this intertwining come about, which also I thought was an interesting pattern.
Yeah.
Well, with regards to culture, again, I actually thought that a number of people talking about culture being a barrier would go down, but it actually went up this year. And my thinking, as I mentioned, was mainly due to the fact that I felt with the maturity of processes, with a lot of the management buy-in and budget allocation, it sort of becomes more second nature for people to not say culture is a barrier, but to me the fact that it is, and it has actually gone up in terms of percentage, means that there are still avenues for silos to be busted with an organization, because culture, as I've seen it, most people identify with collaboration in some way. How easy is it to collaborate? How many silos are there? And am I able to do this in a way where the baton handing off is seamless? And if they feel somebody else is a gating function to them being more productive or successful, then they attribute it to culture. So did something come across in the conversation?
It's interesting because, I mean, we've been asking this question for a while, right? And I think what's happening is there's the challenge of culture at a business level, and the sort of the perceived, the understanding that, okay, culture and internal processes is a problem. And then you get sort of executive level support, and then everybody starts moving the ship towards DevOps, and now you have to deal with the person sitting next to you. And so I think that businesses, organizations have agreed, okay, this culture thing is something we need to deal with. Let's get the executive support in place, and let's move this forward. I think it's a positive measure of organizations that are actually in the weeds, actually trying to make this happen. So if you're trying to do DevOps and you're in culture and you're not running into culture, then you're probably not really tackling all of those real challenges. And we definitely see that with our customers that are trying to, they are starting with, a great way to start is with one group and maybe a greenfield project. and that's a great way to test the waters. But then once you see some success there and you want to take it to your support teams or your QA guys and R&D and start to spread it out, then you start to run into more and more issues, and I think that's a measure of people actually, taking action.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. If you're not running into cultural barriers, that means you may not be doing something right. Just one thought on culture, and we can let the topic go, was I also was thinking that it might have to do something to do with job preservation, and there is a bit of a perception there with certain segments of people that we talk to saying, hey, automation is probably going to take my job away. And so there is a resistance to things that bring more automated best practices, and we've always seen that is not the case, in the sense you always gravitate to higher value functions and you automate the mundane, but there is still that perception which might be contributing to resistance and cultural barriers.
Yeah, I love when our users are able to take automation and do something new and see that excitement of, okay, I can get out of the weeds and start doing some amazing stuff.
That's right, yeah. What's your take on complexity? Because, it can manifest itself in different forms, and we've seen that come about in the context of infrastructure complexity earlier when we're tackling infrastructure automation, as also application complexity and environment complexity now. So what is the thing about complexity that it's actually amongst the top 3 in almost all the surveys that I've seen in the last 10 years?
I've had a number of conversations with folks that say, it's cloud, it's supposed to just make everything easier and take it all away, and that's the complexity away, and that's clearly not the issue. And similar to culture, I think it's when you start to really move towards cloud and take a true DevOps approach, you start to run into these places in your organizations that just have not, the light has not been shown on them, right? So you really want to take automation and self-service and all this, these good practices and take them to all the different pieces of your organization, and you start to see where there's challenges. And another piece of the complexity that we definitely see with a lot of our customers is that there's a lot of growth happening in the industry, and a lot of organizations are growing through acquisitions. And so on the one hand, business is moving forward, but part of that means taking on new organizations that have had their own practices, and it creates a real siloed effect. And so how does a large enterprise deal with all these different branch offices and islands of practices? So I think that part of the complexity there is just the complexity of how the IT backbone is growing as organizations grow and take on other businesses.
Yeah, there's a period of exponential change that is going on. If you look at the architectural models, we moved from mainframes to distributed client-server computing, and then you sort of went back into the data center consolidation, and then you went into more of a cloud and an access mechanism, and now we're looking at something like a cloud and an edge. And so the models seem to be shifting, and with it the pace of change also is somewhat exponential. The applications have an impact, and in reality a lot of the enterprises we talk to have made significant investments into different technology architectures, and these aren't broken, they're all very functional, and so they need to preserve it. And so in some ways it actually leads to the next insight, where what we call as legacy today, in fact, some of the financial services institutions that I have personally talked with are still running on mainframes. They're using COBOL-based applications, and they're working. There's no need for them to disregard it just because it's something else
right? Yeah.
bright and shiny. Yeah. And so for them, it sort of makes sense to integrate these, and maybe that's again another area where they experience complexity. But for organization that isn't necessarily born in the cloud today, which could be a lot of the organizations in the last few years, you do see significant infrastructure investments, data center investments. You see applications that have been homegrown, And really, if they need to all come on board new processes, I think it does touch upon culture. It does touch upon complexity.
I mean, another piece of that, and we don't think we have any numbers in here, but you know, at the same time that cloud adoption is increasing, and companies are maturing in terms of their IT platforms and new architectures, we're still seeing huge security risks and cyber threats and outages, and so as we move faster, there is risk, and I think companies are thinking more about how do I manage that risk, and are seeing, you know, we need to address all of the end-to-end IT technology, and that is complex.
Absolutely. And you know, with regards to the last point about developing a hybrid and multi-cloud strategy, in some ways it's a hedging of a bet. The hybrid actually gives you a graceful path to preserve what you have versus where you want to go. And I think the multi-cloud approach allows you not to sort of get locked into a certain vendor. You want to be embracing platforms, technologies, tools, operational models that allow you to, you know, move from one to another, either based on the type of application or your SLA requirements or cost, whatever it may be. But you know, I think that's the read I get from that, where they view it as more flexibility, more choice, more freedom, maybe.
Yeah. I feel like a couple years ago, hybrid cloud seemed like the advanced ideal option, right? And I can click a button and I can just automatically migrate workloads into public cloud. And now it seems like a pragmatic reality of organizations want and need the option to be able to move workloads to the cloud, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a seamless automated transition. It can be moving certain teams to public cloud while you're leaving your production workloads running on your private data center or what have you. But if you take that approach, a lot of our customers are starting to take certain teams and certain workloads and running them in public cloud, and that's a huge step forward. So I think it's very pragmatic.
And what I like about it, and again, this is based on conversations with almost all of the public cloud vendors and some of the private cloud vendors, is, you know, you look at the dominant private cloud vendor like VMware and the number one public cloud provider with AWS. They've actually come together to form a relationship and offer up to their customers ways and means of making it easy to have a hybrid cloud posture. And I think this is very reassuring, because there was a public versus private before, and it was in the interest of either vendor to say, hey, you know, all workloads need to remain private or public. And I think what you talked about, the pragmatism, that's actually come in, and vendors are taking action upon this. And so when vendors start to take action, it makes it easier for customers, because they don't need to go put that band-aid to stitch these two together if the vendors are proactively doing it themselves. So that's, in my mind, a very positive development, and we have seen that with VMware and Azure as well recently. And I'd imagine that would happen across most of the cloud platforms, where they understand that the way to hold their customers is not by creating a lock-in, but by offering more and more value. And keeping the doors open for them to come in or go out. But when they are with you, then offer them the best value possible, whether it's in terms of performance, cost, experience. And so I think that's going to actually make a big difference. There's also a comment here about monitoring and maintenance of the automation process is also challenging in DevOps, and is maybe considered as a barrier because they have to spend additional budget.
Yeah.
So I think
I'm glad that was raised, because I think that's one of the challenges to making a wholesale shift to public cloud, for example. I mean, the pricing models and monitoring, and even if you consider the configuration technologies for cloud, deploying an ARM template on Azure or CloudFormers, they're not straightforward right now, and the costing piece is huge. So I think that's where businesses are saying, I'm not ready to make a wholesale switch, but I need to be able to try these workloads. Mm-hmm. And that's actually one of the only ways that a business is going to be able to project the costing, is to just try stuff out and see how do my workloads really run in the public cloud, and what are some of the trends that I see using AWS's cost estimation tools usually.
Yeah, or for sandboxes for that matter, and that's what we're seeing in some of the competency centers as well, where they layer in the sandboxes and public-private cloud environments. So these are the insights that we actually wanted to share with you. Would obviously encourage you to reach out to us through email or through any of the other mechanisms that you see on our website. And would love for feedback from you guys in terms of what you think of the results from this survey, as also some of the insights that we just shared. If you are curious to see how Quali and Cloud Shell can help with some of these, obviously we can definitely simplify and help with some of these, maybe not all of them. That'd be a conversation I'm sure that our teams would love to have with you. And with that, would like to conclude this webinar. For those of you who participated and asked questions, we are offering gift cards, and you're welcome to participate in our survey for 2018. It's currently up on our website, and every month we give away Amazon gift cards for certain survey responses that end up being picked from the draw. So the link is at the bottom of your screen. If you have 5 or 10 minutes to spare, I would encourage you and invite you to go participate in that survey, and maybe your voice will be one of the statistics we share for the next year's results. So with that, on behalf of Hans and myself, I would love to thank you all for joining in this webinar, and do keep in touch. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. We look forward to see what 2018 holds.
Absolutely. Thank you.